Hey everybody, Jennifer Schaus here on Thanksgiving Eve, and thank you for joining us in our webinar series on subcontracting. We've got just a few more left and we're going alphabetically through the various departments. Today's session is complimentary. It's also recorded, so if you're looking for the recording, if you can't stay on for the duration today, we'll have it up on our website and on our YouTube channel probably later this afternoon, or at least by tomorrow if you need a break from your family and need to tune into some government contracting news. Just a quick blurb about us. We are based in downtown DC and we work with existing and established federal government contractors, primarily providing them with GSA schedule support services, getting onto the schedule, modifications, renewals, audits, the whole 9 yards. We've got some events, webinars, and conferences as well, and we've got some events coming up that we'll tell you about in another slide or two. As far as our webinars, we've got close to 600 videos now, all free on our YouTube channel. The newsletter is now hitting over 24,000 subscribers, most of which are government contractors. You can advertise with us or sponsor webinars or conferences and events as well. Find information on our website about that. Our next event is right around the corner on 12/12, Monday, December 12th, from 5:30 to 7:30 in the evening. We've got 6 government entities that are going to show up. We've got State Department, Army Corps of Engineer. From DoD, we've got NSWC, as well as NAVAIR, and HHS is going to be there, as well as the Metropolitan Washington Airport Authority. We're waiting to hear back from the VA and a couple others, so it should be a good turnout. On the government side, we've already sold over 100 tickets on the government contractor side. We also want to thank our sponsors, Proposal Helper, and our friends over at BidSpeed. The Virginia PTAC and ZK Development are our in-kind sponsors. You can register for the event using that link that you see at the bottom of your screen. You can also go to our website, click on events, and you'll find the registration link there. Coming up on Thursday, 12/12, we've partnered with GovSpend as well as ZK Development and Streamline Government Contracts to go through kind of everything you need to know about GSA schedules if you need one, and if you do, we'll talk about requirements, how to market the schedule, and then once you're on the schedule, understanding kind of that back office reporting. The registration link is also on our website under events, even though this is a webinar, so you can register there. And I think the link, you should be able to click on the link in the PowerPoint when we send that out later this afternoon. That's a repeat. And okay, so we want to thank our sponsors. Set Aside Alert Gov Events in Fairfax County have graciously posted our event to either their public calendar or in their newsletter. So thank you to these organizations. Additionally, I'd like to thank the Virginia PTAC. The Virginia PTAC is based out of GMU in Fairfax, Virginia, and offers free one-on-one counseling on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on your business location. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to contact the PTAC. BidSpeed. Thanks to our friends at BidSpeed. The BidSpeed platform helps you to win and increase your probability of winning government contracts. They have opportunities from every federal, state, and local public source in the US. If you're looking for a compliance matrix, a proposal template, a strategic teaming partner, or details on an expiring contract, BidSpeed can help. They're also an official partner of the SBA 7J Management and Technical Assistance Program. Contact BidSpeed at the email or phone number here to learn more. It's in your lower right-hand corner. Government Marketing University. So Washington Technology provides a direct line to the contractor executives who need cutting-edge IT systems and solutions to serve the largest customer in the world, the government market. Washington Technology's goals is to help attendees hear from Justice Department leaders, leverage IT to modernize operations, engage in discussions about upcoming initiatives, analyze how contractors can support their department's mission. Their expert coverage and analysis fuels strategic decision around partnering, RFPs, and resource development, enabling readers to build relationships bid smartly, and win contracts. GovExec, which is the parent company of Washington Technology, is ready to welcome you in Tyson's Corner on December 1st. Register today at the events link there that you see just below the Tyson's Corner note there on the slide. Okay. Three Integrated Solutions and Steel Root have merged, and today they're introducing a new leader in CMMC compliance as the defense industrial base faces the imminent implementation of CMMC. Industry leaders C3 Integrated Solutions and Steel Root have merged to provide a platform approach to CMMC-centric managed services. Their end-to-end CMMC compliance solution built on Steel Root's signature CMMC reference architecture covers 100% of the technical requirements for CMMC Level 2 and accelerates your CMMC readiness. If you are one of the 200,000 plus defense contractors who face immediate pressure to get compliant and stay compliant, they're ready to help. You can learn more at the website that's listed there in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. Okay, now the reason why we're here, we're going to talk about subcontracting opportunities at the Department of State. And it's a quick agenda. We're going to go through some of the introductions about who is speaking today. Mission statement of the State Department, some links. We'll talk about the vendors and the trends that we're seeing, and then we're going to wrap it up with some legal considerations. Oh, sorry. First up is going to be Archisa Meehan. He represents GovSpend, formerly known as FedMine. And Archisa, thank you for being with us today.
Glad to be here as always. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And Archisa and GovSpend have partnered with us on this series, so they spend a lot of time pulling data for this series. So I know it's a level of effort, and Archisa, we certainly appreciate you and the data that you guys bring to the table. Our legal speaker is the lovely and talented Ms. Devin Hewitt. Devin, thanks for being with us today, and I know that you will provide some great insight for our listeners.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, and I hope I do.
Great, thanks. Okay, so a little bit about Department of State. You just grab this from their website. You should know this if you are targeting them, that their mission is to protect and promote U.S. security, prosperity, and democratic values, and shape an international environment in which all Americans can thrive. So just keep that in mind. Here's a list of the various bureaus, agencies, and offices within Department of State. So as you are focused on selling to them, you should know which of these offices you're targeting and who is running that office, who the program managers are, and all of the decision makers and influencers in those offices. We've got some helpful links here, just the direct link, as well as the link to the Small Business Office, Procurement Forecast, and they are in the process, State Department, of enhancing and providing a more valuable procurement forecast. So stay tuned for some great changes that are happening there. They're also going to be present at our December 12th event at the Kennedy Center. You can also take a look at their scorecard to see how they did with all of the set-aside businesses, women-owned, veteran-owned, hub zone, 8A, and all the rest, and keep that in mind as you are selling to State Department. Okay, top 10 vendors are listed here. Probably not any big surprises and a lot of names that most people probably recognize. And I think I'm going to stop talking and turn this over to Archisa. So Archisa, it's all yours. Just tell me when you're ready for the next slide.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone, and happy Thanksgiving in advance. My name is Archisa Meehan, and I'm the Director of Federal Go-to-Market at GovSpend and FedMine. So a little bit about FedMine. We basically integrate all the 18 federal data sets into one easy-to-use platform. We were acquired last year by GovSpend, and now our combined entities provide the best in federal state, local intelligence and data. Today, we're going to be really focusing on subcontracting and how companies can use subcontracting successfully as part of their growth strategy. The data is actually that we're going to be talking about on the prime contracts is coming from FPDS. which is the authoritative data set source for federal contract information. And the subcontract data actually comes from USA Spending, which gets its data from FSRS. Keep in mind that the subcontract data actually is self-reported by the prime or the sub. And there is another data set that the federal government and the SBA uses, which is the ESRS. That data set, at least at this point, is not made public. So I always like to mention where we're getting the data that we're going to be talking about. The next thing that I always want to address is how are you going to use the data that is made available? So as a small business, any business, we really want to understand the primes within an agency that are actually winning contracts and the type of work that they're doing. When you start looking at the details, you actually can even go into the transactional details and see if there is a subcontract plan requirement. And that data is made public. We always encourage our clients to use that information. Also, when you're looking at the data, I always will recommend to filter your searches, based on the type of work that you do. I personally do like to use keywords because it's always interesting to see all the various NAICS codes contracts get awarded under when we use the keywords. But you also want to be able to fine-tune searches based on subcontract plan requirements or place of performance, or basically whatever type of work you as a business are able to perform. Also, something that I always want to mention is that even if there is not a plan requirement, you yet want to be talking to those companies that are winning those contracts, especially if you're in the similar type of work. So let's talk a little bit about the top companies that are winning contracts at the Department of State. One of the other things that I do want to talk about is that, the mission of an agency is really going to determine the type of contracts that are being given out. And this being the Department of State, keep in mind that they do a lot of international work. So some of the contract details and things you'll see is actually based outside the United States. So the first and this data, we're looking at the top 5 based off FY22 numbers. So Cadell Construction is the top company. Next slide, please. Here is the link to reach out to them. Next slide. So if you look at the contracts this company has won, the Department of State definitely is the top agency. They've had actually a nice big jump from the $52 million that they did in FY20 to $379 million to $1.9 billion in FY22. They do some work with the Homeland Security, Army and Navy, but clearly Department of State is the largest agency that they work with. Next slide. When you go into some of the details of the type of work they're doing, you can see that this is a lot of construction related work, mainly outside the United States. You could see that they're doing construction in Brazil and South Sudan and Southern America, so including some work in India. So it's a lot of construction related work outside the United States. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Can you just go back one more? Thank you. Typically, when you go into details of this is when you will understand if there is a subcontract requirement. And then, of course, depending on whether you do work outside the United States is how you would reach out to this company. So, sorry, next slide. The second company is BL Hubbard International. Next slide will have their contact information. Third slide, thank you, shows you again the contracts that this company is winning year over year. Department of State definitely is one of their larger clients since 2019. Department of Navy is another big client of theirs, as is the Army, Department of Justice. Most of their contracts seem to have a subcontract plan requirement. So you could see that little thing where it says subcontract plan, it has an individual subcontract plan requirement. Next slide. And this is more of the type of work that, again, BL Hubbard is doing. A lot of design and construction services outside the United States, including, most of the work is outside the United States. So I always want you to see when, it's sort of think about the mission of an agency as you start looking at the type of work that they're doing. With Department of State, there is a lot of international work. So keep that in mind. Next slide. These are some of the subcontracts that the company has received from all these various companies. That's always interesting to also see that a company that's doing a lot of prime contracts will also have relationships with other organizations and get subcontracts. So keep that in mind. And obviously, you can always get into additional details to understand what type of subcontract work BL Hubbard might be getting. So the next slide. The third company that we're going to talk about is CGI Federal. Here is a link to for the contact at CGI. Next slide. So you can see CGI Federal is big in federal contracting. More than $1 billion every year since FY20. However, you could also see that the Department of State is a pretty large client of theirs, accounting for anywhere from 25 to 30%. And in FY 2022, they won more than $365 million from the Department of State. Next slide. This is some of the work that they do. They seem to be focused more on the passport production support services and on-site management administration at the 4 passport centers and the 23 passport agencies nationwide. So you could get into transactional details, see when those contracts actually expire, when were they awarded, and then, of course, get into the understanding of whether there is a subcontract plan requirement. But again, if there is no subcontract plan requirement, I think it always is helpful to reach out to these organizations and see if there is a teaming opportunity out here. Next slide. So again, you could see in this case, there is an individual subcontract plan requirement. This is the type of detail that you really want to get to, where not only can you see the type of solicitation, get into those RFP details. So as you decide that if you want to talk to CGI Federal, you are well prepared and have a good understanding of the type of work that they're doing and the type of work that you want to assist them with. Next slide. And this was actually pretty nice to get into a better understanding also of the contracts that CGI has been winning from all these various companies that have actually reported the subcontracts, whether it's Intuitive Research and Technology Corporation, Deloitte, Iron Mountain Solutions, and also they seem to do a lot of subcontract work for SAIC. So there is a wealth of information that is available. I think we always want to make sure we are focused. I find the most successful companies are those that are always focusing on what is it that they excel at, what is the type of work that they want to do. As you do more of your market research and gather that intelligence to help you create your strategies. So next slide. The next company that we're going to talk about is PAE Government Services. The parent company is Amentum. Next slide is the link to the contact to reach out at Amentum PAE. And so again, with PAE, you can see that they have a pretty good mix of clients with the Department of State, Justice, USAID. But you could also see that in FY22, the Department of State is one of their largest clients at $283 million. And you can actually see that they did receive a subcontract from Raytheon that's been reported way back in FY20. Next slide. Here's a quick look at the contracts that they've been winning based on their NAICS codes. Facility support services, as also administrative, management, and general management consulting services are the main NAICS codes that CGI has been winning contracts under from Department of State. So I wanted to make sure I show that to you. It sort of gives us a good indication also of the type of work that they do. And then the next slide. And again, this is, you can see that they do a lot of support services, not just in the US, but across outside the US too, whether we're talking about Colombian National Police Aviation Support Services or, support services at the Embassy of Baghdad. So again, a lot of interesting type of work that they're doing. What I found pretty interesting about their contract with the Department of State was that they are winning a lot of these as task orders on their OASIS unrestricted pool contract. So, it's also important as we are analyzing the companies to see if they're winning these contracts that might or might not have a subcontract requirement on various vehicles that some of the agencies use. And in this case, it's good to see that it's interesting to note and keep in mind if you talk to this company that they do win a lot of contracts on their OASIS unrestricted pool. So the next slide. And here again, CGI is doing a good job of even reporting their subcontracts. So in this case, you could see that for one of the contracts that they have won where the place of performance is Colombia, you can actually see all the subcontracts that they are making public and they are reporting. I love it when we see the subcontract data when it's reported, because we actually will link it to the prime contract at the task order level, which really helps us understand even better that on a specific prime award, what are the various companies and what is the type of work that they're doing, what is the dollar amount, and when does the prime contract expire. So again, this is just a lot of visibility and transparency that you get as you want to create your strategies and basically decide that, how do you do subcontracting? How do you create your relationships? Who do you talk to? Coming from a perspective of having the knowledge of the company that you want to meet and you want to do work with always goes a long way. Next slide. And the last company is CSRA, which is the parent company is GDIT. Next slide is the link to register and reach out to them to do business as a small business. Overall, you can see that the grand total is the total contracts that CSRA and this specific SAM UEI has done. And of that, you could see that the Department of State definitely is a large portion, with FY22 contracts obligated at $266 million. The next slide. Again, you can see the type of work is a little different than the other companies that we went over, with a lot of global support strategy work, visa services, and different NAICS codes, more of the computer facilities management services type of NAICS codes, and PSC codes are more professional program management support driven. Again, some of their prime contracts don't have a plan requirement. However, that does not mean that they do not work with other smaller businesses on contracts. Next slide. And again, you can see most of the prime contracts that they have, rather all of the prime contracts they have with Department of State is in that computer facilities management services NAICS code. And the next slide, I think that's it. Okay, and then these are some of the contracts that they have won as a subcontractor. And again, I think it's super important to even understand the work a company might be winning with another organization. Just to give you, again, understanding of where is it that they do the work, what is the type of work that they're doing for the other primes. I think next slide. And that's all from me. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And always a pleasure to be here, Jennifer, and happy Thanksgiving. And I am now going to hand it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much. That was good data, great insight. If anybody has questions about digging into the data further, please contact Archisa directly. Her contact information will be displayed again on the last slide. And we did see a couple questions coming in. Just keep in mind that we don't take any audience questions, just to keep these kind of short and to the point. So if you guys want a subscription to GovSpend, or you want to talk to Archisa further about any of the data that she displayed, you can contact her directly. And thanks again, Archisa, that was great, and happy Thanksgiving to you and your family. It's always nice to have you with us. What I'm going to do next is run through some of the marketing best practices, and then I'm going to hand it over to Devin, and she'll wrap it up, and then we'll send you guys on your way. So our marketing best practices really don't change throughout this series. So as Archisa said, I think a couple times at least, is kind of do your homework and know who you're talking to, know the mission, know what these companies do, spend time on their website, register as a small business, bring something of value to them, is really important, because they get thousands and thousands of calls each day, each week, with companies that haven't done their homework. So the more you can stand out by doing a little bit of research, which just takes a little bit of your time, kind of sleuthing and spending some time on sam.gov, on their website, looking at Google News alerts to find out, what the company's been up to. Have they been acquired? Did they merge with another company? Did they just win a big contract at USAID? That, something like this information can certainly help you sound more educated and set you apart from the competition who's potentially also trying to subcontract with them. Number two, as I mentioned in my little spiel right there, was just register as a small business on their website. That's the first thing they're going to ask you. So if you've already done it, you're a step ahead. And make sure everything is complete. Don't leave anything blank. And your SAM registration, they will look at that. So make sure that that is absolutely current, that you're going in there, let's say on a quarterly or at least 3 times a year basis, just to make sure that you've, if your business size has changed, if your address has changed, if your point of contact has changed, just make sure all of that is absolutely correct and current, that you've got the right NAICS codes, contract vehicles, everything, that you've checked all the right boxes. I always think it's important to connect on LinkedIn as well. Follow the company. All these companies will have a business profile on LinkedIn. So just check on the box that says follow. You'll then be able to see the feeds that the company's putting out, whether it's press releases or they've hired somebody, or just basic company news and information. Again, the more you know about the company, the better off you're going to be. And when you go into their website, look at the events that either they're sponsoring, look at the associations that they're part of. You're going to obviously be able to then go to these events and association meetings where the company employees are also going to be. You could shake hands with them. You can look at them in the face and talk to them about the opportunity that's coming up for a recompete at State Department or whatever department or agency you're potentially kind of stalking them for. And then back to LinkedIn, I would also look at the SBLOs, the Small Business Liaison Officers. These are going to be the equivalent of the OSDBUs and the OSBPs at the federal agencies. They're responsible for finding the subcontractors. And I will tell you, just based on factual information, the OSDBUs, the OSBPs, and the SBLOs, they all say the same thing, which is it's not that they can't find the women-owned, the veteran-owned, the hub zone, or the 8As. It's that they can't find those small businesses who have the past performance, who can actually show up and do the job. So you always want to lead with your capabilities and not your set aside designation, because that part is easy. There's plenty of you guys with those check boxes. What you really want to bring to the table is your value and your core capabilities. And so if you can bring an opportunity to them, or you're kind of well positioned in advance, meaning, you know, a contract that's coming up for recompete in, let's say 9 to 24 months out, I think that's a good time to start engaging with them, versus something that's coming out for a recompete in 2 weeks. You're going to be a day late and $1 short to the game. And that's just some highlights there for marketing best practices when you're trying to work with the direct primes. Okay, I'm going to move over to the legal perspective, and just as a reference, we did covered the FAR supplement, which are going to be the federal acquisition regulations for State Department, and kind of their contracting regulations, rules, and nuances can be found by clicking on that YouTube link. I will stop talking, and I'm going to hand this over to Devin Hewitt, who will guide us through the legal perspective. Devin, I'm just going to stop on this slide and just let me know whenever you're ready for the next one, and I'll advance.
Okay. Well, thank you for letting me do this. Although I'll be honest, I think if I remember correctly, Jennifer, you couldn't really find somebody to do this. And so I volunteered. And then I realized, oh, it's the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. No wonder nobody volunteered to do it. And then I started getting into preparing for this presentation. And then I thought, oh, I realize why nobody wanted to do it. These subcontracting opportunities at Department of State actually aren't all that good, unfortunately, let alone the prime contracting opportunities. And we'll talk about that. So I thought, oh God, there's really not that much to talk about. But then having said that, I thought, well, gee, in my 30-year legal career, I've actually done quite a bit of work involving the State Department. So I thought, well, maybe that's why. I've done actually quite a few protests. And then finally, I don't know if Jennifer even knows this, but I grew up in the Foreign Service. My father was an ambassador, and my mother worked for the CIA, but I lived abroad my entire childhood. And then I actually married a Foreign Service officer. We're divorced now, but for 15 years, I was again in the Foreign Service. And so perhaps I'm probably the lawyer that knows most about the State Department and their contracting practices than anybody else. So I guess I'm very well qualified to talk about contracting and subcontracting at the State Department. So next slide, let's start. All right. Oh, I guess the one other thing I should say is maybe there are people on the line who know me. I've been doing this for 30 years. My primary client base are small businesses, although they can be fairly large small businesses. And I have represented some large companies like Janus Global Operations, which had a very large Department of State contract. But I am sort of, tell it like it is, cynical, I guess, government contracts lawyer. And I think, see it from a business point of view. I mean, I've been through the trenches with my clients. And so I think I'm going to provide a perspective that may be a little harsher and a little different than others. So, just take that into account. And I say this because I'm going to give you, the spiel that is in a lot of the regulations about what the government's goal and policies are, though I can tell you from my clients' perspectives, and I suspect from a lot of you on the line here, is that it's a lot of lip service. So yes, the government's policy is that it wants to provide small businesses with the quote unquote maximum practical opportunity to participate in federal subcontracts, as well as in prime contracts, but also federal subcontracts. And when a contractor, a prime contractor, receives a contract which exceeds the value of the simplified acquisition threshold, which I believe now is 150,000, when a contractor receives that, it must offer the quote unquote maximum practicable opportunity for small businesses to participate in the performance of that prime contract. And indeed, the contracting officer is supposed to insert in that prime contract this FAR clause, 52-219-8, utilization of small business concerns. So that's the setup, if you will, the background, the environment for using small businesses in the subcontracting realm. Next slide. Well, if you look at the Department of State in particular, it says, I think in the OSDBU pamphlet on doing business with the Department of State, it expressly states that it is the expectation of the Department of State that small businesses will first be subcontractors with this Department of State. So they say right off the bat that we don't think you'll be prime contractors. So, you know, note to self. There is an executive order that was passed quite some time ago that says that, you know, contractors and agencies must encourage minority business participation. And there is a Department of State policy that expressly urges non-federal entities, contractors, to use minority business enterprises in the performance of a contract award. And it is Department of State's policy to use their best efforts, these entities, to solicit goods and services from minority business enterprises. Now, that was issued quite some time ago. Minority business enterprise is not a term that is used in government contracting anymore. It is a term that's used at state level. I mean, you know, states. And I've not seen this language used in any federal contracts, but I'm throwing it out there because I found it when I was doing this research. So take it for what it is, which I say is not much. Next slide. All right, subcontracting goals. As probably many of you know, the SBA, together with agencies, establishes government-wide subcontracting goals pursuant to the Small Business Act. And they also establish prime contracting goals. But in addition to that, they establish subcontracting goals. And these are the goals. And these are the goals for fiscal year 2022. The government-wide goal, for some reason, did not make it into this chart, I think is 24%. But the goals for subcontracting are as stated here. The Department of State goal is 42%. And it's 5.5 for 8A, women-owned, and then 3.3 for SDV, OSB, and HubZone. Next slide. When you look to see how Department of State has been doing on that, with the 2021 goal, it was 38% for small business overall. They actually made it to 50. 1% almost, and you can see they exceeded it when it came to the women-owned and 8A, woefully deficient on SDV, OSB, and HubZone. And that has been the case pretty much government-wide, and certainly with the State Department. Now, they look pretty good, right, when we're talking about small business, particularly as it compares to their goal. But, footnote here, a significant footnote, these goals do not count work done overseas. Now, once you know that, you can see these statistics in a whole different light, right? Because USAID and Department of State are probably the first two agencies that do most of their work abroad. So, of course, they're going to exceed all these goals in comparison to other agencies because most of the work they do is exempt. So I don't know how meaningful this is for small businesses generally, but since people talk about subcontracting goals, I think in the small universe in which small business contracting is done at the Department of State, to the extent you're an SDVOSB or a hub zone, there will be obviously a preference to contract to those kind of companies. But truthfully, there is a preference across the government to contract through those companies. And I know personally through my clients that are hub zones, it's not that there are not enough hub zones or hub zone set-asides. It's because the hub zone program is so difficult to ensure compliance with. And so that's really the issue, not that the agency won't set it aside for hub zones. So that's a different problem. Next slide, please. Subcontracting plans. Subcontracting plans are required to be submitted by offerors in acquisitions with a value of greater than $750,000 or $1.5 million for construction that have subcontracting possibilities. So let's assume, and you should pretty much assume, that any contractor that's not small, because they're not required for small businesses, has a subcontracting plan. I know Archisa says you can mine this data to see if it has a subcontracting plan. I guarantee you that all of those big contractors have subcontracting plans. Now, whether they have a subcontracting plan for a particular opportunity will only depend on whether that particular acquisition has subcontracting possibilities. And that is extremely hard to determine. However, looking at the data that is in FPDS or USA spending, which I'll talk about later, is not helpful because that is historical data. That is something that shows you that has already happened. And an offeror has to submit a subcontracting plan with its offer. So often it states the percentage of its subcontracting dollars that will go to different types of businesses. Often it has to name the business, and often it has to include teaming agreements or evidence of this potential relationship. Sometimes it doesn't. It depends on how the acquisition is designed. But in any event, there has to be some basis for the subcontracting plan intentions, and that is supposed to be reviewed. So knowing after award that that company has a subcontracting plan really ain't going to help, because if you approach that contractor at that point in time, they likely have already lined up their subcontractors. So I think going into it and developing a strategy, it's important to know who's contracting with the Department of State. But let's assume they all need subcontractors, and let's assume that they probably all need them going forward, and use that as a threshold moving forward. And then you can narrow it down according to different other discriminators, which I'll talk about in the coming slides. Now, for purposes of this strategy analysis, if you will, Department of State incorporates in its agency subcontracting goals. It does have a FAR clause that it flows down, and in other agencies, a prime can say, these are my subcontracting goals for my subcontracting plan. Now, most primes will try to mirror an agency's goals, or it will try to satisfy or over predict what the deficiencies are in that agency's goals. But in this case, the Department of State says in your subcontracting plan, you have to meet our goals. So our goals have to be your goals. So that's interesting. But here is the rub. And again, goes to show you what's an FPDS really is not relevant. And that is subcontracting plans are not required for contracts performed entirely overseas. So what you really need to know is whether this contract needs to be performed overseas or not. And if it's not performed overseas, you can assume they have a subcontracting plan. If it's performed overseas, they don't have a subcontracting plan. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't need subcontractors, but I think that does come back to my initial impression when I got into this, that Department of State ain't all that great place to do for subcontractors and for small businesses. I know, say it ain't so, but given my 30 years of working at federal contracts, there are a lot of other places that you probably could spend your energies. But if you're a unicorn, and you could be as we get into this, then more power to you. Next slide. Okay. Now, these are, possibilities. There is a clause in the FAR that says, that an agency can use an incentive subcontracting program. And that means that the agency can include financial incentives for the prime to subcontract to small businesses. And that could be, generally speaking, if there are fees, award fees in a cost plus contract, that they can base the award fees on using subs, et cetera. And there is a specific Department of State clause that says, if funding is available, yes, you could use that clause. Now, whenever is funding available for these extra, nice things? Never. Funding is never available for that. And then also, the FAR specifically addresses these type of fee incentives. And as I said, they're generally in cost plus contracts. Now, the Department of State Acquisition Regulation Supplement does encourage contracting officers to use other kinds of incentives, like how well a contractor has met its goals in its prior subcontracting plans as an evaluation factor. That might work well. I have seen that in procurements before. I have seen actually more frequently where an acquisition has given extra points for a contractor who commits to use a certain amount of subcontractors, which is different than a subcontracting plan. And so that could work, but I got to tell you, it's not a major evaluation factor. And given, in this context, the subcontracting plans are not required in an overseas context, I can't tell you that this is really gonna tip the scales in any small business's favor. But they're here, and at the looking sort of in a big perspective, what I've learned over the years is that a lot of government personnel and even the OSBUs and even contracting officers do not know that there are these tools in the FAR or in their policies. And I know this because when I have to argue on behalf of clients, I focus on these and I throw them at these people and they don't even know they exist. Now, they're not going to always carry the day because, as we all know, the government does what the government wants to do. But sometimes having these and presenting these to government representatives does give them something to grab onto if they want to go their way. So it's worth mentioning it. Next slide. Okay, flow downs, something always important to subcontractors. Let's step back. In any agency with regard to any subcontract, there are always 3 categories of flow down clauses. And hopefully most subcontractors know this. There are always the mandatory flow down clauses, and those are clauses that by their very terms instruct the prime contractor to flow these clauses down to their subcontractors. There is a more narrow list of FAR flow down clauses that says, okay, these have to be flowed down to subcontractors that are providing commercial items. It is a more narrow list than the mandatory list above. And then there's a list of contract clauses that are discretionary. And by that, I mean that prime contractors, and that's me if I'm advising a prime contractor, in which I say, you know, you don't have to, but, you know, to cover your risk as a prime contractor, given that your subcontractor is doing X, Y, and Z, you should probably flow it down to them. So those are generally the 3 categories of contracts. However, what really happens? What really happens is the prime flows everything down, because really, who has the time to figure out what should be, what is discretionary, what's better? A prime is going to flow everything down. And what really happens from a sub perspective is they don't have the time to go through every clause and figure out which one applies and which one they can argue about. You got to pick your battles, you know, yada, yada, yada. So what typically happens with flow down clauses is that the parties agree that there'll be this, you know, generic clause before the flow down exhibit saying, you know, the sub will agree to perform or comply with the clauses that are applicable, which is pretty much kicking the can down the road. And you fight about order of precedence, and you fight about payment and all the things that, you know, are really more immediately of concern. But having said that, the Department of State Acquisition Regulation does have 31 specific clauses in addition to the FAR clauses, but only 2 are required by their terms to be flowed down to subcontracts. And 1 has to do with the examination of records, and that's, you know, a specific clause regarding who can look at contract records of the subcontractor, and the other ones have to do with security for information technology. You know, I don't know what they say, but there you go. Next slide. Okay, well, this might be important and actually is probably of interest. Security clearances. Given the nature of what the Department of State does, security clearances is obviously something that's likely to come up. Uncleared subcontractors must be sponsored for clearances by their prime contractors. And in order to do that, the prime contractor must demonstrate that the subcontractor has a specific need to have the clearance to perform the work. And prime contractors should try to get the lowest level clearance necessary for that sub to do the work. Clearances won't be given to one-man shops, and by that I mean, you know, consultants or independent contractors. And then I think the most important issue or controversy in this regard is with regard to joint ventures, because DSS has stated unequivocally that joint ventures need clearances at the joint venture level. Why is this an issue? Because if you're a small business, I think you should be aware, and you probably are aware, that some of the more sophisticated, larger procurements are being won now by joint ventures under the mentor-protege agreement. And that is true with regard to some of the more sophisticated requirements requiring security clearances. But here's the problem. DSS requires joint ventures to have security clearances for the joint venture. However, since joint ventures are generally formed for a particular opportunity, the joint venture itself doesn't have a contract, a previous contract for which the agency has sponsored a clearance for that joint venture. And the joint venture, since it hasn't had a prior contract, hasn't been sponsored for a clearance by its members. Its members may have clearances, but the DSS is not impressed with that. And although the joint venture does not have people that are going to perform the contract, and even though the joint venture is not going to have a location or a SCIF, DSS has nonetheless raised form over substance and said, no, we don't care. The joint venture needs to have a security clearance. So SBA tried to fix this several years ago and issued a rule in which SBA said, no, this is ridiculous. That if the members have a clearance, the agency should allow the joint venture to receive an award. Specifically, if the primary and vital requirements of the acquisition require a facility clearance, then the small business member of the joint venture should have the facility clearance. If the ancillary requirements of the acquisition require the security clearance, then the majority member can have the facility clearance. Well, you know, the security services did not care about that, so that didn't help. Ultimately, what happened was in 2021, there was a protest filed by a company called InfoPoint, actually 2021. And it was a procurement conducted by the Air Force. Long story short, the procurement said you had to have a facility clearance by award. There was a question and answer about joint ventures. Air Force said the joint venture itself needed to have the security clearance, and the joint venture protested. There, at the same time, there was the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2020 said that the joint ventures, Metro Protege joint ventures, did not have to have security clearances as long as both members had security clearance. Ultimately, GAO said that the joint venture did not have to have the security clearance based on the National Defense Authorization Act, and that the SBA rule was consistent with that. Now, what does that mean for the Department of State? No idea. No idea what that means, because there hasn't been a protest on that. But I do think it sets a very good precedence. I also think that it doesn't mean, even without this case, that a joint venture that is unpopulated, that has a facility security, an FSO, which you can't have and still be an unpopulated joint venture, can't get a security clearance that is virtually sponsored by the members. I think that that can happen, and indeed, I think the security services have recognized that. But you have to do it, I think, early enough. And, you know, it would be rocky, but I think given this protest background, that can happen. So, you know, it's a difficult thing, but it's not an impossible thing, is, I guess, what I'm saying. Next slide. And I know we're at the end of our time, but I have some other things to say, so I think we can keep going. Next slide. Oh, okay. No, back to the other one. Okay, so how do you want to, you know, how do you qualify as a small business sub? You have to be small under the NACE code. The prime applies to the subcontract work, which may not be the same NACE code applicable to the prime contract, which actually is a little bit of a loophole, because it may be that that you're not qualified to do the prime contract work, but you can manipulate it with the prime. So you can do the subcontract work. And the prime can rely on the representations of the subcontractor, which of course ought to be truthful. And the contractor or a contracting officer or any other interested party can challenge the representations of the subcontractor. Now, have I ever heard of that happening? No, I have not. But again, it's out there. It's a tool. So, I'm throwing it out there. So if there's a situation where that is a significant and meaningful tool for you to use, it's there. Next slide. All right, so I think I sort of I was interested to know, good to know. I went and looked at some of the information that our CHISA looked at, but I looked at it from a different point of view, and I think I noticed some things that were sort of interesting. I took the top prime contractors, and this information came from the OSBU website, doing business with the government, but it is fiscal year 2021 data. So clearly, I think our CHISA has better or more current data. But you can see that it's, there are probably many of the same players that are the top government contractors. But here's what I thought was interesting. This is the percentage of work that they do out of the budget of the State Department. So if you look at the top contractor, PAE, for fiscal year 2021, they were only doing 4.63% of the work. And then you go down to CGI Federal, which, I mean, this is in order. I think they're not the 10th, but maybe the 9th. They're only doing 1.9%. So, I mean, none of these companies are doing a huge percentage of State Department's work. So, you could go to any of these and not feel like you're getting cut out of a whole percentage of work. I mean, there's a diversity of contractors that are doing work for the State Department. So you don't really need to put all your eggs in one basket, I guess. Next slide. This I thought was interesting for this reason, a couple of reasons. One is, as we, I think, have seen, the majority of work, and I know this myself, is construction and maintenance and repair of embassies abroad and consulates and passport offices, which are somewhat like consulates. And, that's where all their money is going. And that's overseas. And what have we learned about? You don't need subcontracting plans overseas. All that work is not reflected in subcontracting goals. So, small businesses, you're sort of on your own there. And let's face it, how many small businesses, got, remote offices in Africa? Not many. This is really not going to be an area of growing opportunities. And I apologize if I'm insulting somebody who's got a nascent, business in Guyana, but my experience is that that's not really the area where small businesses want to grow in the State Department. And that's going to cover, building construction, security guards and patrol service. We're talking about the guards at all these embassies. I know I represented one of these contractors that were going after guard services at these embassies. And then facility support services, again, for these embassies and facilities. Of course, there are many of these services in the United States too. But then you get to where I see, when I started looking at this, the major NACE codes and the major work other than all this work is computer work. And that's where small businesses, I think, are going to get most of their work. If you do any kind of computer systems design, computer related services, computer facility management, I think that's the entry point for any small business in the State Department. That's what I took from this data. I'm not an analyst. I've never even done anything like this before. But if you ask me, if you're interested to do business with the State Department, do it through IT work. All right, next slide. All right, well, this looks like my last slide, but I have some interesting things to say about this. So I went to the OSBU site, and they all say they have all these resources, which generally in my experience are useless. For example, they say one of these resources is the Small Business Act. Like, you're gonna read the Small Business Act. I have never read the Small Business Act, at least not voluntarily. That's not gonna help you. But I did look to see what other resources they have on their site and what could be somewhat interesting. Well, they have this pamphlet saying doing business with the Department of State. And, most of it is sort of a general marketing knowledge that hopefully we all know. Know your business, do a capability statement. Yeah, right, we all know that. But that's where I got the list of primes. And that's where and then they have a list of the PSC codes. So those areas that, where they contract the most, and that's where it was clear to me that IT is the place you're going to get in. But, that data, that particular one, I think was based on fiscal year 2021. So it's a little stale. The most, I think, helpful and important document on that site was the Department of State fiscal year 2023 forecast. First of all, it was the most up-to-date. In fact, it had been updated almost last week, November 16th. It's the most specific, so it will tell you the exact requirement, what's being procured. It'll tell you the timing. It will tell you the incumbent, the name of the incumbent. So you know already who's performing the work. So it's current, it'll tell you the incumbent. It's, it's a forecast. Now, there are a lot of caveats saying, that this is no guarantee that they're going to do it, etc. But you are getting real specifics. And, as I said, most of the information that you get on FPDS and USDA.gov, that ship has sailed. That horse has left the barn. Getting teaming or subcontracting opportunities with those organizations, then it's too late. But looking at acquisition that is down the road, that is the time to make connections. And if you know the incumbent, then there is a lot, you're ahead of the game talking to the incumbent. So I thought that was excellent information. It was up to date, it was specific, and it had a specific contractor. It also, I believe, it may say whether it was going to be set aside or not, another very important thing. Then there is a report on the OSBU site, which I have not found anywhere else, and it's called the DS 1910 report. Now, the way it's described is the OSBU review of upcoming acquisitions. Now, it doesn't say what these acquisitions are reviewed for, but what I think they're reviewed for and what they're supposed to be reviewed for is whether or not the particular acquiring activity has ensured that small businesses have been given the opportunity to participate, or this requirement has been set aside. So what's on this report is acquisitions that are coming up and how they're going to be procured. And so what you see is whether it's going to be set aside or whether it's going to be restricted. So it's a little more specific and short term than the forecast, but you do get some sense of not only the nature of the procurements that are being set aside, but where Department of State is going to get those set aside opportunities. And so I went through there, and what I thought was really interesting about that report was there were some just plain set asides for some sort of weird things. Like one was certain reviews of armored vehicles, you know, very specific unicorn things, but there were a number of set-asides under NASA SOUP. Like, who knew? But many orders under NASA SOUP. There were several orders under the GSA schedules. And then there were a couple of one-offs under a VA schedule in HCATs. So, I mean, you know, I would, well, of course, what do I know about actual government procurement? But that's something I don't think I would have thought of, that NASA SOUP would have been a major source of set-aside information for, you know, for the Department of State. So I think that report had some value, and, you know, combining that report possibly with the Department of State procurement forecast, I think that gets you some particularly good information. Now, what did not give me any information, and frankly, I think you could skip, is SBA. It's so annoying, SBA's website. It gives you nothing of use. And in particular, you may have heard that SBA has this subnet, a list of all the prime contractors that have subcontracting plans. Just assume that every prime contractor has a subcontracting plan, unless, as I just told you, it's Department of State and it's overseas. Do not look at that list. That is useless. And GSA has a list and DOD has a list. No, that's not it. Like I said, don't spend your time there. Now, FPDS and USA Gov, they do have information. I think Artisa did a good job of mining that information, but I will tell you there are some interesting things in there. It's not going to be much different than what the OSBUs have already. It's like I said, it's a bit stale. But one thing I did notice on that I was able to, you know, sort of mine that was a little different. I got to see what the set-asides were under NACE codes, and I looked at also the values. And so when I looked at the NACE codes, what a surprise, almost all of them were under IT. So IT in small business, I think that's your best way to get into Department of State. And one more thing, when I looked at the values, almost, I mean, I didn't go on and on. I mean, how much time do I really have, frankly? But I did go on for a little while, and they were 3 million something, 3 million something, 3 million something. Okay, what do you think that means? They were all sole source. So, you know, obviously, the best way to get into Department of State is under a sole source, you know, 8A, women-owned small business, hub zone contract. And if you're a sub, presumably, that's the way to go. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to say are two things. One is what the Department of State OSBU site does do well, much better than most agencies, is if you go to their site, they list, you know, here are the individuals at the OSBU that are responsible for, you know, a number of things. On that site, they have, of course, a number of links to a number of other resources, most of which are useless. But they do have a telephone directory of almost everybody, which is frankly amazing. And they have the direct phone numbers of these individuals. So that's great. They have the direct phone numbers of a lot of people. And as Jennifer just noted, somebody from the office of, you know, from the OSBU will be at her event. Now, the other thing I'm going to say is the contact info that Artisa, I looked at those websites links. Well, most of those links are just to the contact us. They're not really to the small business liaison officer. You know, the OSBU is probably going to know the actual individual. So yes, you can you know, register the forms online. That'll get you some of the way there. But my experience talking to my clients, if you want a team, don't go to the SBLO. I can tell you, I've represented some of these large companies. I've represented Leidos, SCIC, Janus Global Operations. Those people, they don't like the SBLOs. I'll tell you right now, you need to get to the owner of that program within that company. And the OSBU may help you with that. The OSBU might know the small business liaison officer, but you really need to get to the owner of the program in that big company. So you sort of have to go do some threading of the needle. But, you know, the first start is registering, but you got to go a little further than that. And finally, you know, do a mentor protege. At the end of the day, I have represented, and this is a little story. I have a company that I got into the 8A program. He did a mentor protege with the Department of State. And I think it was 2 years ago, he sold his company for $8 million. Okay, it wasn't $40 million, but he walked away with $8 million. Not a bad story. And I have to say, to any small business nowadays, you got, you know, and in Department of State, you got to do a mentor protege agreement. So on that note, have a great Thanksgiving, and you're welcome.
Great, Devin, that was awesome. Great information as always, very candid, very clear, and enjoy your enthusiasm for subcontracting and all the information that you know that's related to it. So you guys have Devin's information here if you want to leverage her legal services, and if you guys need a subscription to any of the data or want to talk to Archie's about any of the information she presented, you've got her email there. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. This has been recorded. You'll get an email probably in about within the next 2 hours. That'll have a link to the slides. It'll have a link to the recording. We'll also post it on our website where you can look at various webinars about mentor protege, about subcontracting, teaming, partnering, everything under the sun. And thanks again, Devin. Thanks, Archisa, and thanks everybody who joined us live.